Vladimir Putin has a math problem, and it's not the kind you can spin away in a Kremlin press briefing. In the first 6 months of 2026, Russian forces advanced across roughly 600 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That sounds like progress, until you look at June alone. That single month cost Russia nearly 40,000 casualties for 30 square kilometers of land. 30. At that rate, capturing the remaining Ukrainian-held part of Donetsk region would take Russia another 14 years. 14. On top of the 12 years, Russian-aligned forces have already spent trying to take that same region. So today, we're going deep into the numbers the Kremlin doesn't want you to see clearly. The battlefield math, the economic strain, the political pressure building inside Russia, and what all of it actually means for how much longer this war can go on the way it has been. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some analysts think 2026 might be the year the war's momentum quietly, permanently shifted. Let's set the stage properly. Since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, Russia has poured enormous resources, men, machinery, and money into grinding advances across eastern Ukraine. In the early phase of the war, Russian forces made rapid gains in the south and made a serious attempt at Kyiv itself before being pushed back. After that failed attempt, Moscow's strategy shifted. Instead of a fast, decisive war, it became a war of attrition. Slow, grinding advances in the east, particularly around Donetsk and Luhansk. For a long time, the Kremlin's message to its own population was simple: slow but steady. Victory is inevitable, even if it takes time. State media reinforced this constantly, showing incremental village captures as proof that the special military operation was proceeding according to plan. That message worked for a while. Russian forces did keep grinding forward, village by village, year after year. But 2026 has been different. Independent researchers tracking the war using geolocated open-source battlefield data have documented something the Kremlin can't easily explain away. Russian territorial gains have not just slowed down, they've collapsed. At the very same time that Russian casualties have continued to climb. This isn't propaganda from either side. This is what happens when you compare satellite imagery, verified troop movements, and independent battlefield tracking month over month. And the trend line is brutal for Moscow. Let's get specific, because the numbers here matter more than any political statement from either side. Analysts who track the war closely say Russia's armed forces are aiming to capture the remaining 20% of Ukraine's partially occupied Donetsk region by the end of this year. That's the Kremlin's stated goal. The problem is, Kyiv points out that Moscow has already missed 14 previous deadlines to do exactly that. 14 deadlines, missed. Not once, not twice, 14 times. Every few months for the past couple of years, a new internal deadline gets set, and every few months, that deadline quietly passes without the objective being achieved. And the current pace makes the newest deadline look almost fantastical. At the rate Russian forces are currently advancing, capturing that remaining territory would take over 5,000 days. That's not a typo. That's roughly 14 years of continuous fighting, layered on top of 12 years Russian-backed forces have already spent trying to take the same ground since 2014, when the conflict in eastern Ukraine first began. Meanwhile, the cost in lives has only gone up. June 2026 alone saw an estimated 39,500 Russian casualties, for a gain of about 30 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's an area smaller than most mid-sized towns. Some estimates suggest total Russian losses since the war began now run well into the hundreds of thousands when you combine killed and wounded. This is the core contradiction of Putin's war right now. The human and material cost keeps rising, while the actual territorial return keeps shrinking. It's the kind of trend that, in any other context, would force a serious strategic reassessment. The question is whether the Kremlin is capable of making that reassessment, or whether the war has become too politically important to Putin personally to change course. So why is this happening? A few forces are converging here, and it's worth walking through each one. First, Ukraine has shifted its approach. Rather than trying to match Russia tank for tank, artillery shell for artillery shell, Ukrainian forces have leaned harder into what analysts describe as asymmetrical tactics. That means long-range drone strikes, precision attacks on logistics and supply lines, and hitting Russian military and industrial targets far behind the front, not just at the contact line itself. Instead of trying to hold every meter of ground with manpower, Ukraine doesn't have an unlimited supply. This approach targets the things Russia actually needs to sustain an offensive: fuel depots, ammunition storage, rail links, and command infrastructure. This matters because a modern offensive doesn't run on soldiers alone. It runs on logistics. If you can slow down or disrupt the flow of fuel, shells, and replacement equipment to the front, you don't need to win every firefight. You just need to make it progressively harder for the other side to keep attacking at the same intensity. Second, Russia's manpower and equipment losses are catching up with it. Sustaining an offensive year after year requires a constant flow of trained soldiers and functioning armor. Early in the war, Russia could still rely on Soviet-era stockpiles of tanks and armored vehicles, refurbished and sent to the front. But those stockpiles are not infinite, and refurbishing older equipment takes time, industrial capacity, and components that have become harder to source under sanctions. When the casualty rate is this high relative to territorial gain, the math simply doesn't sustain rapid advances anymore. You can throw more men at a battlefield, but at some point, the returns diminish sharply, and that appears to be exactly where Russia's summer offensive has landed. Analysts increasingly describe this phase of the war less as a series of breakthroughs and more as a slow, costly erosion on both sides, with Russia absorbing a disproportionate share of the cost for a disproportionately small amount of ground. Third, public rhetoric from Russian military leadership has notably shifted. Russian officials have increasingly framed the war not just as a fight against Ukraine, but as a broader confrontation with NATO and the West as a whole, arguing that Kiev's battlefield claims are essentially propaganda funded by Western backers. In televised remarks, Russia's top general has told Putin that Ukraine's government is trying to convince its Western sponsors that it has retaken the initiative on the battlefield, while framing further analysis of Western involvement as necessary for future decision-making. That kind of framing often signals one thing: an attempt to explain away a lack of progress on the ground by pointing at a bigger, more abstract enemy. If the war isn't going well against Ukraine specifically, it's rhetorically easier to reframe it as a heroic stand against the entire Western alliance, because that's a narrative that can absorb almost any setback without looking like failure. Now let's talk about what's happening away from the front lines, because the battlefield numbers don't exist in isolation. They're connected to what's happening inside the Russian economy. Running a war of this scale for this long is extraordinarily expensive. Russia has had to dramatically increase military spending, which now consumes a significant share of the federal budget, money that would otherwise go toward infrastructure, healthcare, education, or other domestic priorities. That spending has been sustained partly through Russia's energy exports, but international sanctions have made it harder to sell oil and gas at full market value, forcing Russia to offer discounts to buyers willing to work around Western restrictions. At the same time, the war has created serious labor shortages. Hundreds of thousands of working-age men have been sent to the front, some have been killed or severely wounded, and others have emigrated to avoid conscription. That's a direct hit to Russia's labor force at a time when the country already faced demographic challenges before the war even started. Industries far removed from the military, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, report difficulty finding workers, which pushes wages up and contributes to inflation. To keep recruitment numbers up without a full mobilization, which would be domestically unpopular, Russia has relied heavily on financial incentives. Signing bonuses for new recruits have grown substantially, in some regions reaching sums that are large multiples of an average local salary. That's an effective way to keep volunteers coming in the short term, but it's also expensive, and it disproportionately draws from Russia's poorer regions, where the bonus money represents a bigger relative incentive. That, in turn, creates a war that increasingly looks, regionally and economically, like it's being fought disproportionately by Russia's least wealthy citizens, while Moscow and St. Petersburg's economic life continues largely undisturbed on the surface. None of this is unsustainable overnight. Russia's economy is large, and it has weathered sanctions longer than many expected back in 2022. But the trend lines matter. High military spending, labor shortages, inflationary pressure, and growing reliance on expensive recruitment incentives all point toward a war that is becoming more costly to sustain with each passing year, precisely at the moment when territorial returns are shrinking. Here's where it gets interesting beyond Russia's own borders. There are signs that shifting battlefield realities are having an effect well beyond Ukraine's borders. Reports suggest that intelligence briefings on Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities have influenced how Western leaders, including in Washington, are approaching support for Kyiv, with some officials reportedly recalibrating their expectations about how sustainable Russia's current war effort really is. A shift in tone from key Western leaders on continued support for Ukraine can matter enormously, because it affects everything from weapons deliveries to sanctions enforcement to diplomatic pressure applied on both sides. There's also the diplomatic dimension. Earlier in 2026, a brief 32-hour truce was arranged around Orthodox Easter, proposed by Ukraine's president and agreed to by Putin. Truces like this tend to be symbolic more than strategically significant. They rarely hold for long, and they're often used by both sides as much for public relations and prisoner exchanges as for genuine de-escalation. Still, the fact that both sides remain willing to engage in these kinds of temporary, limited agreements suggests that neither side has fully closed the door on negotiation, even while fighting continues at scale. Meanwhile, Russia continues to lean on its relationships outside the Western Bloc, particularly with China, and through platforms like BRICS, to soften the economic isolation imposed by sanctions. Putin has taken part in BRICS summits and maintained regular contact with Chinese leadership, framing Russia's position as one of a country building alternative economic and diplomatic partnerships, rather than one being isolated. Whether that framing matches the underlying economic reality is a separate question, but it's clearly part of the Kremlin's strategy to project resilience regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. Inside Russia, the economic and social costs of a stalling war are harder to hide with each passing month. High casualty numbers for minimal territorial gain are exactly the kind of statistic that's difficult to spin into a domestic victory narrative, especially as sanctions, labor shortages, and military recruitment pressures continue to strain everyday life for ordinary Russians. At his year-end press conferences, Putin has continued to project confidence, telling Russians that forces are advancing and that Moscow remains on track to achieve its military goals, while also signaling openness to a peaceful settlement that addresses what the Kremlin describes as the war's root causes. That combination, projecting strength while leaving the door open to negotiation, is a familiar Kremlin balancing act. It lets Putin claim he's never desperate for peace, while quietly keeping the option available if the war's costs become politically unsustainable. But domestic control of the narrative only goes so far when the underlying numbers, casualties, economic strain, missed deadlines, become harder to hide from ordinary Russians who have relatives at the front or who feel the economic pinch directly. Putin has led Russia for a quarter of a century, and much of his domestic authority has rested on an image of strength, stability, and competence. A war that drags on for years longer than promised at a human cost this steep is precisely the kind of slow-burning problem that erodes that image, not through a single dramatic event, but through years of accumulated strain. That raises the real question hanging over the Kremlin right now. How long can a war be sold to your own population as steady progress, when the numbers on the ground tell a very different story? So where does this leave Putin? He's committed to a war that, by the numbers, is producing less land and more casualties with every passing month, missing deadline after deadline, facing a battlefield that's shifted in ways his own military doctrine wasn't built for, an economy absorbing the growing cost of a conflict with no clear endpoint in sight, and a domestic population increasingly exposed to the gap between the official narrative and the reality on the ground. The question isn't really whether Russia can keep fighting. It clearly can, for now. The state has resources, and it has shown a willingness to keep paying the human and economic cost. The real question is what it will cost, how long that cost is politically sustainable, and how much longer the numbers can be spun before they simply can't be spun anymore. If you want to understand where this war is actually heading, not the headlines, but the numbers behind them, subscribe and let me know in the comments. Do you think Putin changes strategy, or does he keep pushing forward regardless of the cost? And if you think there's a specific angle of this war I should cover next, the economic side, the diplomatic side, or the battlefield side, drop it below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.